President, now former President, Bashar al-Assad of Syria well understood that dictatorship is an all-or-nothing proposition. Once you wield total power, you either keep wielding it or take your pick of exile, imprisonment or death. This was why, as the Arab Spring wobbled and toppled tyrannies across the Middle East in the early 2010s, Assad was willing to fight so hard to keep his job, even if he had to burn his country and scatter his people to do it. Assad's ruthlessness won him a decade or so longer in office than certain of his fellow quarries of the Arab Spring: Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali of Tunisia, banished to Saudi Arabia; Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, tried and imprisoned; Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, murdered in a drainpipe. And in the end, Assad timed his departure wisely, fleeing for Moscow before the rebel army reached his capital. But 53 years of miserable misrule of Syria by the Assads, Bashar and his father Hafez before him, is over. As of this broadcast, it is not entirely clear what comes next. The group who led the charge to Damascus, the debatably reformed al-Qaeda offshoot Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, are trying to establish some sort of provisional government, while fighting continues on several fronts across the country, involving players both internal and external. Even when Syria stops being a military battleground, hopefully sooner rather than later, it will remain a diplomatic and strategic one, upon which most of its neighbours will attempt to project themselves one way or another. What do Russia, Turkey and Iran want from Syria now? How much of a chance will a new Syria get to establish itself? And how do you overrun an entire country in a week? This is the Foreign Desk.
Most of the Syrians, they really want to go back. And if left to their own devices, the Syrians would truly try to rebuild this country. But don't push them out. Help them so that they can help the others, and that we don't have, God forbid, in another 5 or 10 years, a repetition of a bad situation.
The decisive moment, I think, in the campaign was the fall of the city of Hama. Mm-hmm. And that triggered lots of other rebel groups to rise up against the regime.
Well, this is a moment now of negotiation. It will be a drawn-out process in terms of what the future holds for Syria. Russia will be trying to navigate what role it can, what it can salvage. And Iran will very much be looking to do the same thing. But it faces sort of Herculean challenges in being able to do so.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined first of all from Vienna by Rime Allaf, a Syrian-born writer and political analyst. Rime, it's probably hard to know where to start with any of this when talking to any Syrian at the moment. Are you able to sum up what this has been like, watching the events of the last couple of weeks, for a Syrian person abroad?
It's very hard to put into words, and every day I have to remind myself that we are just day 1, day 2, day 3 after the liberation of Damascus and the day that Bashar Assad fled. This started, of course, 8 days prior to that with the liberation of Aleppo. At the time, we were not sure what was going on. Most of us are following still Syrian news and Syrian affairs, but nobody expected that it would happen this easily. And by the time Damascus came, we were in a state of frenzy, all of us. So I believe nobody slept. I certainly did not. We heard about that they were approaching Sednaya jail even before we heard that Bashar Assad had fled. And that was, I believe, the second or third biggest emotional shock for us during those events. So, it truly is a lot of conflicting emotions for most Syrians, I would say. There's elation that the Assad regime has finally fallen, or at least the head of the regime is gone. There's anxiety because nobody really knows what's going to happen. There's also some questions and fears about the fact that this liberation finally happened at the hands of, or the leadership of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, as you would know it, and an uncertainty because the opposition that has been working for years to bring down the regime is mostly in neighboring countries. It's all around the world. So we need to put all these pieces together before we can say for sure where we stand.
Are you finding it difficult, and do you think other Syrians are finding it difficult to even start imagining what a new Syrian future could look like? Because it's not just Bashar al-Assad, it was his father Hafez al-Assad. That's 54 years, I think, between them. Most Syrians cannot remember somebody called Assad not running the country.
Indeed, it goes. So it's basically we have 3 generations and even 4 generations of Syrians who either were affected themselves or their parents or their grandparents. And we've never known a world without Assad. It's ingrained in every element of society, in the education, in the Ba'ath Party apparatus, which did influence where you got a job, if you got a job, and the security and the intelligence services. There were 12 different branches that controlled everything in our lives. And then there was the head, this mafia that introduced this crony capitalism in the name of an open economy that really was designed to help them enrich themselves. Today, I think Syrians are trying to remain hopeful that the Syria that they've always wanted, it may be a utopia. It may be a vision that will take years or maybe never arrive. But the revolution that began in March 2011 was called the Revolution for Dignity. And I think this is where I always would like to bring whoever I'm speaking with, the audience, your listeners, friends, acquaintances. It began as a revolution for dignity. I don't believe that the Syrians were asking for the moon. They were not asking for the stars. They were asking to be treated well, to have equal rights to everybody else, to have a chance in life. And this is how it began. This is something that the Assad regime from day one said would not happen. Today, they're still afraid because when they had that dream in 2011, a dream that had been accumulating over 11 years of Bashar Assad's rule, there were no armed factions. There were no foreign militias in the country. There were no other occupying armies from Russia to Iran to Turkey to Israel to the US. So where we are today, Andrew, I would say is very different. We don't have the same innocence and the same naivete that we had in 2011, that all these beautiful Syrians would stand up and just chant and say, we want dignity and we would be treated well. The opposite has happened, unfortunately, but I think this is where the anxiety comes. And they understand that it's going to be a struggle still. It's not a matter of weeks or even months. I think we're in this for the long term.
As far as it's possible to tell right now, it does seem likely that HTS, at the very least, will play some part in the future governance of Syria. Obviously, if you look at the resumes of a lot of people involved with HTS, there are considerable grounds for concern. This is an organisation that grew out of an al-Qaeda affiliate. Its leader has a history with Islamic State as well. They are a proscribed terror organisation by the United States and the United Kingdom, among others. They have in recent days been at pains to try and sound perhaps somewhat moderate. Do you find yourself, and I'm sure most Syrians want to believe all this, do you find yourself entirely able to believe all this?
I'm again in a place where I want to believe everything I'm seeing. I want to believe that the streets are going to remain calm. I want to believe that the temporary governing body, which I would like to be temporary, truly. They said they would be there till the 1st of March. I would like to believe that they can control the security, that they can retake all the weapons from all these militias who just melted into Damascus and the different cities. But, I'm a realist. I have been working on Syria since 2000. Through my writings when I was at Chatham House, when nobody spoke about Syria. So I know not just the regime, but I know our society and I know our neighborhood. And I do not believe that it's going to be as easy as we had hoped. HTS, to zoom out a little bit and look in the bigger context, was created in the middle of utter chaos and most importantly, of utter carnage by the Assad regime. And that is one element that I think people need to consider. that for the most part, people have turned to arms, but also they've turned to extremist understandings of religion when they felt abandoned by the world. Because in 2011, there was no Al-Qaeda in Syria, and there was no HTS, and there was no ISIS. When we look back at the first month and couple of years of the Syrian revolution, and we saw how immediately the Syrians were being shot, and then the artillery came and the tanks, we had Scud missiles fired from the regime, from Damascus to Aleppo, and vice versa. So today, it's very easy to forget what the Syrian people went through. And I truly believe that it is when people feel abandoned that they are told and they feel that their only salvation, the only savior can be the religious element. And unfortunately, there are many people who have a lot of money and who are willing and enthusiastic about financing such ventures. When we in the West have been preaching for years about democracy and helping people be free, and then we turn, that creates new problems. Syria itself, you mentioned HTS is on the terror list. Absolutely it is. But so is the Assad regime since 1979. It is listed in the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. So is the PKK, which is now allied with the US and has carried out so many attacks on Turkish soil, on Turkish citizens. Hezbollah, the organization that perhaps has most harmed Syrian civilians and helped the regime in its sieges and its killing, is also, of course, listed as a terror organization. That is our problem today. Syrians are seeing a lot of double standards around them, and they're seeing that just as the world was more or less quiet while these killings were happening in the name of stability, in the name of Syrian sovereignty by the Assad regime, they are trying to look at HTS and see in it a means to an end. Again, I'm speaking from a very, not just objective, but very optimistic outlook. I want to be clear about that. And I'm praying I will not be proven wrong.
Just finally on that optimism, many millions of Syrians around the world, the refugee diaspora created by 13 years of war, will right now, I guess, be testing their own optimism against what they do next, because there is now the option. Can I go home? Should I go home? How do you see that thought process going for most Syrians abroad? Do you think, because a lot of these people will by now have started businesses, families and whole new lives in other countries around the world, will there be a big rush to go back, do you think, or will they be a bit, given the last 13 years, a bit more cautious?
Caution will be exercised by all, I'm sure. There are people who are dying to go back home. Those people are those who felt abused, mistreated, insulted in several countries. You have probably seen, I hope many of your listeners have seen, the drone footage of the humongous traffic jams of cars coming from Turkey into Syria, and the human traffic by foot and by cars on Masna, which is the border between Lebanon and Syria, close to Damascus. A lot of people want to go home, but a lot of these people do not have homes to go to because they were completely razed to the ground by the Russian Air Force or Assad's barrel bombs. This is something we have to consider. For the people who want to come home, I think these are the first ones, the ones who felt miserable abroad. As you rightly mentioned, there's a lot of people who are in Europe, in the UK as well, who came, who worked, who became part of society, and who established businesses, who have a life now, who have children that go to school there. So I think that emotionally, most of the Syrians that we are talking to, that we are following on social media and in our own gatherings, they really want to go back. Even if they do not go back permanently, I believe that they will be those who help rebuild the country and be a bridge between the two. However, there's also those who have heard from governments like the Austrian government, the Germans, and several others in Europe, who immediately said, great, Syria is free from Assad, we will begin deportations. This, I feel, was a stab in the heart of so many refugees who became settled in several countries because they thought, okay, you don't need to kick us out. We want to go back. And, for to end on a lighter note, I will tell you that many people, when they heard that Syrians were leaving, they said, well, what about my shawarma? What about, all the good food you brought? Leave us something. So it's truly emotional days for everyone, Andrew. And I think that if left to their own devices, the Syrians would truly try to rebuild this country, to bring international help. This is where I stand. I think we need something of the magnitude of a Marshall Plan for Syria, because it's 70% of Syrians lost their homes. And for the rest, I think a little bit of patience with them would be the human and kind and sympathetic attitude to take with them. They are desperate to go home. They have family, but don't push them out. Help them so that they can help the others, and that we don't have, God forbid, in another 5 or 10 years, a repetition of a bad situation. Unfortunately, no country has survived the Arab Spring as it wished, neither Egypt nor Tunisia. And these were countries that we were looking at for a while. So I think Syrians want to go back, but when they're sure that it would help everybody if they did.
Rime Allaf in Vienna, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Not that Bashar al-Assad deserves any sympathy, but it is unlikely as of this broadcast that his head has yet ceased spinning. As recently as maybe 3 weeks ago, Assad probably thought that things were ticking over pretty nicely, at least for him and his cronies. The first stirrings of a rebel offensive were detected in the northwestern province of Idlib around November 27th. 10 days later, the rebels had the country. Human history is substantially comprised of stuff that seemed impossible until it happened. But how did this specific impossible thing happen? To tell us more is David Kilcullen, former Australian Army officer, counter-insurgency advisor to US General David Petraeus and US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, president and CEO of Cordillera Applications Group, and author most recently of The Ledger, Accounting for Failure in Afghanistan. David, thinking first of all about the events of the past week or so with your counter-insurgency hat on, were you surprised by how fast this happened?
No, we know from long history, and I can give you a number of examples, that whereas insurgencies tend to degrade slowly, states collapse quickly. Once a state starts to unravel, you get this accelerating process of collapse. And that's exactly what we saw over the last 11 days or so.
But was that a function of what the rebels did, or was that those weaknesses of the state?
I think it was three things. One, the state was particularly weak, a lot of corruption, a lot of struggles by the Syrian government to recruit fighters, and a lot of, if you like, collapse of confidence by the people in the legitimacy of the government. So it was already pretty weak. And also on the government side, Iran and Russia and Hezbollah from Lebanon, who'd been critical allies of the regime, were just not available over the last couple of weeks because of other things going on. Then the second issue was, the rebels, which we can talk about in more detail in a minute. And the third thing was what political scientists call a preference cascade. So the decisive moment, I think, in the campaign was the fall of the city of Hama. Mm-hmm. And that triggered lots of other rebel groups to rise up against the regime. So it was no longer just HTS advancing from the north, but the whole country rose up. And I think that was probably the critical moment in hindsight.
Is there anything, or are there things that a rebel militia and insurgency can do to bring about that preference cascade, to usher a situation towards that tipping point? Or do you get the sense that the rebels might have been nearly as surprised as everybody else was?
One of the things about preference cascades, and it's pretty well attested in the literature, is that it always looks incredibly obvious in hindsight, but it's extremely difficult to predict. And the original study on this was done back in the 80s to do with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, where in retrospect, it looked obvious, but no one could sort of see it coming until it began to happen. So I don't think that the rebels or any other resistance group can pick the moment, but I think you can be agile enough to exploit it, which is what they were, partly because they spent 5 years since the ceasefire of 2020 building up a really professional and capable military force up there in their stronghold of Idlib in northwestern Syria.
But on the subject of that build-up, does that strike you as something that could have been entirely organic? I mean, they've clearly had an amount of help here, haven't they?
Yeah, there's various allegations, some about Turkey and some about Ukraine helping them. But I think, Andrew, actually, you and I have spoken about HTS before, and I've been saying for years that they are one of the most impressive organizations to come out of the war on terror or the Arab Spring. They have been very politically sophisticated. They've got a relatively pluralistic civil governance structure that they built up in Idlib. They've got a military academy. They've got weapons factories. Like, all this stuff came about, I think, through the vision of rejecting Islamic State and its incredible brutalization of populations and saying, no, the way here is to build a popular front. And of course, this is consistent with successful rebel and insurgent groups throughout history, but it's the first time in the region that we've really seen that level of sophistication, probably from any group other than Hezbollah. And it's worth noting that Mohammed al-Jilani, the head of HTS, comes from the Golan Heights and probably is very familiar with that Hezbollah style of creating, if you like, a full spectrum system rather than just a military element.
So do you detect an element of, I guess, hearts and minds operation in the way HTS have gone about this since they launched their assault as well?
Absolutely. And also before that, I mean, they were dropping leaflets calling on people to surrender from drones. They had a whole organization that purely was there in order to get members of the regime security forces to defect to the rebellion. They've really emphasized discipline and not attacking civilians. So they've really been putting a lot of effort into this for a while. And we saw this working for them, particularly after the fall of Aleppo, right? The big moment was when they leaped forward 150 kilometers further to Hama, and the defense of Hama collapsed on the 5th of December. But in the week before that, they'd seized Aleppo, but then didn't get into a sort of ISIS-style slaughter of the innocents. And people from Aleppo were saying, well, actually, these guys are quite friendly and they are not attacking us. And they were, bringing forward bread supplies from Idlib and humanitarian support. So part of that was a political move to make it clear to people that you've got nothing to fear from the rebellion. So it may or may not turn out to be sincere over the long term, but it was certainly very effective during the campaign.
I mean, there's a question of Syria's peculiar geography, which I think you've already partially answered by talking about the unwillingness when the crunch came of Syria's army to fight. But Syria, if you look at a map, it's basically one highway. It's the M5, which comes south from Aleppo via Hama and Homs to Damascus. And if you have that road, you have Syria. For an insurgent militia like HTS, does having one route to focus on make the job easier or more difficult? Because if you look at the map, you would think you should be able to defend one road.
Yes and no. So this isn't a road through dense mountains or jungle that is hard to attack from the flanks. It's desert or farming country, actually, in the middle of the country. And there's a couple of other factors, right? So really early in the campaign, around the 27th or 28th of November, the rebels took the air base and the airport just east of Aleppo, which not only meant that the regime couldn't fly air support out of that area to strike them from the north, but it also cut off a really major highway to the east of the country. And then when they took Hama, they were poised to seize the town of Homs, which is only another 40 kilometers or so further south. If you take Homs, you not only dominate the M5, you also cut off the coast, which is a key area of regime support, from the inland, and you dominate the breadbasket, the sort of central agricultural area of Syria. And I think at that point, everyone went, oh shit, like the rebels have now got their hand on the throat of the regime's ability to maintain control. So I think, yes, in theory, it would be easier to defend just one major highway. But in this case, it was the combination of key road junctions, the airport, and the highway itself.
If we think ahead to the near future, we have also within the last week seen Israel apparently determined to destroy all of the remaining military kit of the Syrian military. The Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and Israel's Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has been quite upfront in saying we are doing this to forestall any possibility of these weapons being turned against us. Does that incapacitate HTS in the near future? Would they have been banking on all that stuff falling into their hands?
No, I don't think it does. That stuff was probably going to be retained by the regime anyway, which is still going to hold a sort of rump area on the coastline and in the Alawite Hills, just east of the Mediterranean. So I think that it's mostly being denied to the regime's remnant rather than to HTS. The other thing, which is sort of a bit counterintuitive, is the Israelis have now seized the full Golan Heights and moved to within about 10 kilometers of Damascus. That creates an external threat to Syrians. And of course, whatever you think about Bashar al-Assad, a lot of Syrians don't like Israel. So that external threat may actually cause people to rally behind HTS. So I think that the political side of it is still a bit unclear how it's going to play out, but I don't think that the destruction of all that military equipment by Israel will weaken HTS. It might even strengthen them because it removes the possibility of their regime bouncing back while giving them an external threat to unify around.
And when you look at this with your military historian's hat on, does it remind you of anything? Something like, I don't know, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968, the Rwandan Patriotic Front's march to Kigali in 1994. Does it have obvious antecedents?
Absolutely. And I'd just point to three. First would be the fall of the Afghan Republic in 2021, which to this happened in only an 11-day period and of that final Taliban offensive. But you saw lots of preparation by the Taliban and then a sudden breakout that resulted in that preference cascade and lots of bases suddenly collapsing. Another example would be the fall of Saigon. At the beginning of March of 1975, big North Vietnamese offensive going on, but the government of South Vietnam still in control of lots of its territory, still fighting hard, still a functioning government. Then they had the decisive Battle of Xuan Loc in early April. And from there, in about a 9-day period, the entire Republic of South Vietnam collapsed. And maybe the most extreme example would be the Batista regime in Cuba, which collapsed in only a 5-day period. So early December 1958, Fidel Castro orders Che Guevara to attack the town of Santa Clara in central Cuba. That falls on the 28th of December. Within 5 days, Fulgencio Batista has a New Year's Eve party in his big palace in Havana and then suddenly announces, hey, it's all over, I'm leaving, and heads for the airport and flies straight out to the Dominican Republic. And the whole thing collapses in one day. So as I said, it's quite normal actually for states to collapse rapidly. A guy called Gordon McCormick at the Naval Postgraduate School in California wrote the definitive piece on this in 2006 called Things Fall Apart, where he explained how that happens. And it's something that we're all pretty familiar with in the business, but seeing it again happening for the umpteenth time just reinforces how much of a pattern that is.
I mean, to close on a somewhat optimistic note, will there be, or perhaps should there be, various tyrants around the world regarding the events in Syria of the last couple of weeks with an amount of nervousness? Can it happen anywhere?
It can happen anywhere, but it can't happen anytime, right? I think the critical issue here was not only the preparation of HTS and the build-up of the Syrian Salvation Government that it created in the north, but also that timing where the Russians are fully committed to their final push in Ukraine. Hezbollah is heavily damaged by the war with Israel. Iran is under pressure because of its, escalating confrontation also with Israel. So all the allies, it was picking that moment that made it, I think, feasible. And then a string of successes early in that 11-day campaign resulting in the triggering that cascade of popular support collapsing. So, I think it could happen anywhere, but it might not necessarily happen unless the moment is right.
That was David Kilcullen, President and CEO of Cordillera Applications Group and author of The Ledger, Accounting for Failure in Afghanistan, among other terrific books. This is The Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. As things stand, among the foreign parties scrambling to adjust to Syria's new reality, Turkey appears the victor, Russia the possibly vanquished. Joining me to discuss whether it is as simple as that, spoiler, it isn't, Burcu Ozcelik, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, and Mark Galeotti, political analyst and author most recently of Forged in War, a military history of Russia from its beginnings to today. Burcu, let's start with you. Is it clear so far how much of a hand Turkey had in the planning and execution of the events of the last couple of weeks?
I would say that it's very far from clear. There have been various analyses and speculation by observers. I think it's far more complicated than what has been said in the public thus far. And that by that, I mean that it's not as straightforward as HTS is a proxy armed group under Turkey's control. That's not the case. Turkey certainly has had indirect relations with HTS. And elements of the Syrian National Army, or the SNA, which Turkey has more openly, technically, logistically, supported and funded over the years, as elements within SNA have collaborated with and assisted the HTS in their march on to Damascus. But that's not one and the same as saying that Turkey has absolute control and authority over HTS. But it does have influence over HTS. It has done because of Idlib, the province over which HTS has been governing since 2017. Turkey has control over that border crossing. So economically, there have been ongoing and significant links, and Turkey has been sort of a lifeline for HTS in the territory under their control.
Mark, to bring in the Russia angle on this, I'll wrap up a couple of questions in one. One is, do you think Russia was any more or less surprised than everybody else at what unfolded and the speed with which it unfolded? And also, does Russia really care about who runs Syria as long as they get to keep their airbase and their port?
In terms of the surprise, absolutely, the Russians were caught on the hop. And it's quite striking that we've had the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Narishkin, popping out to say how, in reality, this is actually more of a blow against the Americans and so forth. Nonsense. But again, essentially a fairly smooth political operator trying immediately to take away the blame from the fact that they were caught wrong-footed. In terms of caring, I mean, obviously, look, they would have preferred that their client Assad remain in control of Syria. On the other hand, given just how quickly and catastrophically his regime imploded, there was nothing really they can do. And so, as their second best, they absolutely don't really care who controls Syria so long as they control the Tartus naval base and Khmeimim air base. Those really are important for wider aspirations in terms of capacity to operate within the Mediterranean and continue to keep their forces in Africa supplied. So I think at the moment, they're very much looking at a plan B, which is just to try and maintain control of those bases.
Burcu, if that's Russia's preferred outcome, as far as we can understand it so far, what is Turkey's preferred outcome? We know that the Turkish military is in action in Syria, mostly against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are, of course, a Kurdish militia. But is it clear what Turkey is driving at here? Do they want to destroy, disarm, defeat the Kurdish forces within Syria? Are they intending to keep those so-called safe zones that Turkey has had in the north, which is largely run, I think, by a Turkish proxy, the Syrian National Army? People should probably be following this with a diagram at this point. But if you're looking at this like President Erdogan and thinking maybe a year or two ahead, how does he want this to shake out?
I think that we've had serious indications over the past few years about what Turkish foreign policy and security objectives are with respect to Syria and northern Syria along the Turkish border. One of the top priorities, of course, as you've mentioned, is the future of the Kurdish-controlled administration or the autonomous administration in northeastern Syria. And this is highly contentious because it is governed by the Syrian Democratic Forces. The main element within this umbrella organization, which was set up by the U.S., really, to support the anti-Islamic State coalition. The main element within the SDF is the YPG, and this is very much sort of an alphabet soup, so diagram and acronyms galore. But Turkey sees the YPG as one and the same as the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization. And this really is the heart of the issue. And whilst the US and other coalition partners have long justified support for the SDF on the grounds that their role in the fight against ISIS and now the fight against the prospect of a resurgence of ISIS is essential, Turkey sees this differently. And the concern amongst Turkish foreign policy makers and the security establishment is that a Syrian enclave, an autonomous region, will be a permanent fixture in the future of the Syrian state. So some type of territorial fragmentation or a federal power-sharing state. And this is not in Turkey's interest. They see a YPG or PKK-controlled territory along its borders as an existential threat. And Turkey has made no secret of this. This is a long-standing policy position. So that is, I think, one of the main objectives of any Turkish intervention inside Syria is to prevent that from taking place. And the Turks have long talked to their American counterparts and others in the ISIS coalition that if the fight against ISIS is the reason why you're supporting the SDF, we, as a major NATO ally and partner, can take on this role, right? And there's speculation and questioning around the extent to which Turkey will be able to do that and their commitment to it, given the previous track record and experience with respect to ISIS. The second main objective of Turkey is to ensure the safe return of the millions of Syrian refugees who have been homed in Turkey since around 2015. I think it numbers above 3.5 million at this point. And this has been a highly contentious and divisive domestic political issue inside Turkey. In fact, it nearly cost Erdogan the vote in the most recent local elections because of the backlash against the government for the perceived privileges and benefits that the Syrian refugees receive inside Turkey and the demand that they return home. But Erdogan has remained firm on his point that the Syrians are fraternal brothers, part of this Islamic Brotherhood notion that he long professed to defend. And so he maintained that the Syrians would return only when the conditions were safe to do so. And the third, I suppose, and the overarching objective of the Turkish foreign policy establishment is to see a stable Syria across its border. And no secret, again, that Assad and Erdogan had a highly sort of hostile relationship, and that evolved and changed over the course of the Syrian civil war post-2011. Prior to that, they were on friendly terms. The families vacationed together. But that turned sour very, very quickly with Erdogan's support of the anti-Assad opposition movements and militia in the north.
Mark, does it strike you that the next coming months and years in Syria might also have an effect on the often very vexed push-me-pull-you relationship between Turkey and Russia? Obviously, at various points over the last decade within Syria, they've been on different sides, on the same side, and I'm sure at some points and some junctures or in some theatres, kind of on both sides at once. Does this alter the balance between them, or do they broadly want the same things from Syria at this point?
No, this definitely alters the balance, and it's quite striking that if one looks at Russian narratives, I mean, there are the more, shall we say, sort of unruly elements on social media who essentially will see everything as being a conspiracy with CIA and MI6 and so forth behind it. But if you look at what the official government sources and those people closest to it are saying, they're very much trying to actually portray this as a moment for Turkey and Russia to work together for peace and stability in the Middle East, which actually translates as, we are desperately hoping that the Turks will be able to help us hold on to our bases, or at the very least give us some kind of sufficient period of drawdown that we don't have a kind of fall of Saigon moment, where you've got footage of Russians desperately being evacuated and materiel being left on the runway and such like. I mean, that is their nightmare scenario that they have to pull out, because it'll take about 300 to 400 aircraft sorties to essentially pull out all the Russian personnel and kit. So that will take a hell of a long time. So they know that at the moment they are to a degree dependent on Turkey as an interlocutor. They understand that Turkey does not run HTS, but they also know that Turkey is one of their best instruments for trying to actually build some kind of relationship with HTS. And they also know that if they do lose, in particular, the Hmeimim air base, then actually in order to send fully loaded cargo planes to North Africa to continue to resupply their operations there, they're going to have to fly through Turkish airspace. So in other words, Erdogan will always have his hand on the tap whenever he wants. So I think in this context, absolutely, Russia and Turkey have this strange frenemy relationship in that often Erdogan enjoys essentially playing Moscow off against his notional Western allies in the EU and NATO. But on the other hand, they are rivals, especially for authority in not just the Middle East, but also in the South Caucasus. So, this is an inevitably tense relationship. It's one in which actually Erdogan is often capable of out-Putining Putin by calling his bluff after a particular sort of spate of over-the-top rhetoric. And from the Russians' point of view, they are in this deeply uncomfortable position of the degree to which they absolutely resent what Turkey has been doing in Syria. But on the other hand, at present, they need Turkish support and intercession, and therefore they will play nice.
Burcu, I just want to, given that Mark has broadened the view out a little bit there, I want to broaden it a bit downwards and across to the right from Azerbaijan and look at how Iran is likely to respond to this, because this seems like it's been a bad few weeks for Iran. Obviously, their major proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, has been significantly decapitated, which is something which may have enabled the rebels' advance on Damascus. Anyway, it's hard to see that whoever ends up running Syria next is going to want to have much to do with Iran if they can possibly avoid it. What are the wider ramifications here, do you think, for Tehran? What will they be worried about now that they weren't worried about 3 weeks ago?
I think there's no doubt that Iran, as well as Russia, which we've been talking about, see this, the fall of Assad, as a strategic defeat. And there is a serious rethink happening in Tehran, I suspect, in terms of how to recalibrate their position. I mean, there's no underestimating or trivializing the significance of Syria in Iran's wider geostrategic orbit historically. This predates by far the start of the Syrian civil war and the establishment, the consolidation and growth of the so-called axis of resistance under Iran's authority. So Syria has been a long-standing ally, particularly significant during the Cold War years for Iran, and certainly post-1979, Tehran, the Islamic Revolution. And so the loss is significant for reputational purposes, the symbolism. I don't think it's lost upon the various groups, militia, armed groups within the axis of resistance, that Iran failed to keep Assad going. And this comes on the back of the death of the leader of Hezbollah, the diminishment of Hamas's capabilities inside Gaza, which is an ongoing issue. The absence of a ceasefire there continues, despite our pivoting to Syria, of course, understandably. But there are symbolic, reputational issues from Tehran's perspective. There's also the reality that they have now lost the logistical capability to rearm and reconstitute Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So territorial control over Syria has been lost, and this is significant in the longer term. So Iran's forward defense strategy, which rested on the use of proxies, the strategy of using these armed groups to keep the conflict as far away as possible from Iran, this seems to be falling apart quite rapidly over the course of the event since the 7th of October. And while I think it would be premature to say that now Iranian influence is demised to the point of no return, I think it is true that there's a significant backsliding in Iran, and the realization that they need to pivot to a new way of thinking. But again, it's too soon to call an end to Iranian influence in Syria. There will be, this is a moment now of negotiation. It will be a drawn-out process in terms of what the future holds for Syria. Russia will be trying to navigate what role it can, what it can salvage, in both in terms of its military assets, certainly, but also its reputation in Syria. And Iran will very much be looking to do the same thing, but it faces sort of a Herculean challenges in being able to do so because of the identity, the ideology of the HTS, and the very hard reality that the Syrian civilians have suffered as a consequence of both Russian and Iranian action in Syria. And the HTS will be cautious about being seen as making concessions or compromises with respect to Iran or Russia too soon, because it's still very much searching for a way to boost its legitimacy and to be seen as governing in the interest of the Syrian people, not against their interests.
Mark, I just want to close on one particular aspect of how this might have been seen from Moscow, the events of the last couple of weeks. That is, as it's unclear whether Bashar al-Assad has been summoned for a debriefing from his new host, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, as yet. But would Putin have watched these events and wondered, well, can this happen anywhere else? Might he be thinking back to the Yevgeny Prigozhin mutiny, which nearly was but wasn't quite, and be a bit nervous about, could I be next?
Well, it's interesting that Putin's spokesman has said that he has absolutely no plans to meet Assad in the foreseeable future. I think there is a degree to which Assad, yes, he's been given sanctuary. That's in a way part of the deal. It's the final element of the arrangement that Russia has with its various sort of client dictators. But if all else fails, there will be a place in the bizarre little zoo of ex-dictators in the Moscow suburb of Barovika for him. But I think in terms of whether or not Putin is thinking, well, could that be replicated in Russia? I mean, we're certainly not getting any signs of that. And I think, in fairness, the Russians had for some time been pushing Assad, firstly, to open some kind of negotiations, at least with certain elements of the miscellaneous rebel forces. And Assad had essentially refused to do so. And the Russians had also been warning him about the state of his military, that they were underpaid, undermotivated, and frankly was still not that much more developed than they had been back in around 2017, 2018, which was admittedly better than they were in 2015, but that wasn't saying very much. So I think from that point of view, the Russians have really got their own personal alibi, that from their point of view, look, Assad was warned, he didn't listen to us, and this is what happens to him.
Burcu Ozcelik, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, and Mark Galeotti, Political Analyst of Forged in War. Thank you both for joining us. That is all for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Chris Chermak. Our studio manager was Lily Austin, with editing assistance by Flynn Simons. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.